welcome to another DIAS US election briefing. This week we have Calder Walton, who is the Assistant Director of the Applied History Project at Harvard University. Calder, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. And it feels like the start of a new dawn from here in America, I have to say.
Yeah, we've got you exactly at the right time because we have some results. Or do we have results? Is this President Biden now? Is it President-elect Biden? Is it projected President-elect Biden? Where are we?
Good question, as always, James. We have a projected winner, and that means that we have a president-elect who's projected. The difficulty in all of this for your listeners is that actually it comes down to something called the Electoral College here in the US. And we have had the popular vote, and that then gets translated into an antiquated body called the Electoral College. And the electors in the college are supposed to, and invariably have always, reflected the popular vote. I mean, that's not rocket science, but there's actually no legal obligation for them to do so. They have the discretion not to do that. So there are, if you look on certain blog sites and messaging sites on the internet, there's all sorts of people saying, well, of course, they won't actually translate that in the swing states. I mean, that would be absolutely Armageddon constitutionally here in the US. So like 99.999% of people, I'm incredibly confident to say that Joe Biden is president-elect. He is the projected winner. Not all of the states have come in on their popular vote, but crucially, the thing that changed yesterday, Saturday, that made Biden president-elect was that he won Pennsylvania, and that pushed him over the 270 members of the Electoral College needed to win the presidency. So that projecting that win yesterday pushed him over the limit, and it was mathematically impossible thereafter for Trump to win. Now, President Trump is filing lawsuits as we speak, James, in the swing states to say that there are voting irregularities, that the postal ballots that came in that pushed Biden over in Pennsylvania were somehow illegal. These are really serious claims, and they'll have to be taken seriously. So far, none of his lawsuits have got anywhere with the courts. But, as always with Donald Trump, let's just see what happens.
I mean, this has been an incredibly close election, far closer than the pollsters had said was going to happen. We know that in 2016, there was lots of disinformation. I know this is very much your area with intelligence. I was just wondering if we saw the same sort of disinformation in this campaign, and if that helped make it so close.
Well, I think that we will only be able to find that in the coming weeks, months, maybe even years as documents come out. It's too close to say whether what happened just now in this election was a result. Essentially, James, it's a non-story. It's a history, it seems, of disinformation that didn't make a difference, unlike in 2016. So it doesn't seem to have had the same impact or effect. I mean, that itself is a contested issue about 2016, but certainly there doesn't seem to have been the fire hose of disinformation pushed at key swing states like there was in 2016. Now, is that because particularly the Kremlin and other actors internationally just didn't use the same tradecraft and repeat the same playbook? Or is it because the US intelligence community thwarted this fire hose of disinformation? Impossible to say, we don't know. The National Security Council in the preceding days up to the election said that they had not found any massive attacks, that it had been generally sort of business as usual on the internet. So that, that's from the horse's mouth. That seems to suggest that it was actually just a sort of a huge anticlimax. People in my kind of research, we were all watching this, scrutinizing this, and deeply concerned about the role of disinformation again. And it seems to have been, as they say over here in the US, a nothing burger, meaning there was nothing significant there in the end.
But obviously something we need to remain vigilant about, because if President Trump is making some accusations about voter irregularities, then it's at this point that any of the great power actors that wanted to infiltrate the election would now be the prime time.
Exactly. Well, I think more generally than just this election, it seems to me that elections going forward in Europe and the US, in any free society, disinformation is going to be a key theme that we're going to have to deal with. As it stands, we do not have a coherent strategy in the US, arguably not in Britain or in the EU, for dealing with disinformation that's going to impact elections. We just don't have a coherent strategy yet. We are engaged in, we are in an information warfare landscape, whether we like it or not. And so this issue of 2016 isn't going to suddenly disappear miraculously, as Trump said about the COVID pandemic. It's not going to just disappear. This is here to stay, and the issues about disinformation need to be addressed. Disinformation ultimately only ever, so foreign state disinformation only ever seeks to amplify grievances within a society. So it's for your listeners, just to be clear, what the Kremlin did in 2016 and has done since then, they're not in the business of just creating conspiracies out of nothing and whipping up grievances. They always ever, and this goes right back to the Cold War, they only ever seek to exploit existing grievances within a target society. So in the US, that's race. And we know that race was the primary focus of Russian disinformation in 2016. It will be unsurprising, to get back to your original question, it will be unsurprising to find that Russian disinformation troll farms didn't seek to also amplify race again in this election. But on present evidence, it doesn't seem to have made a huge difference. But as with everything, I think that's going to require forensic analysis over the coming weeks to see exactly what kind of information voters were looking at in the run-up to 2020 election.
Well, talking about the coming weeks or the coming months or the coming 4 years, let's take for granted for a second that there is a President Biden, a Biden administration coming. What's the first thing that Biden's going to do as president? What's his priorities here as the next president of the United States?
Well, let's start with the basics. There will be a Biden administration. I'm fully confident of that. I think that, just so your listeners are clear, I think that Donald Trump will try to do everything he can to make that as difficult as possible in the ensuing 70 odd days before inauguration. But I think there inevitably will be. And when Biden comes into power, he has got challenges that are profound. And the primary one is, of course, the COVID pandemic, that the Trump administration has abjectly failed to deliver a coherent strategy in the US, and that we are entering into the winter months now without a united, uniform strategy for countering the pandemic. Now, obviously, I'm speaking to you, James, in Denmark, and things aren't going well there either. In Europe, nowhere's really, it seems, maybe some Asian countries in New Zealand, Taiwan have got it under control. But certainly Western Europe and in the US, we haven't at all. So I think the primary focus has to be a COVID pandemic response unit. And he said that he's going to announce tomorrow, Monday, his transition team pandemic task force. So he said he's also going to be guided by science and facts, which in most situations you don't need to say that. In the current situation, you do need to say that, and that is refreshing to say the least.
Does this, I mean, you're right. We're not going to see COVID going away anytime soon. You know, the Spanish flu lasted at least 2 years in its biggest phases, and then obviously continuing at smaller levels on from that. And here in Denmark, there's talk about mutations in mink and how that can lead to a second strain coming out, a so-called COVID-20. So are we going to see the US finally step back up onto its plinth and take that place as a world leader in tackling this and actually leading from the front instead of lagging far behind in this global response to a global issue?
Well, I think so. It needs to on several different levels. It needs to both, the primary duty of any government, isn't it, to look after the safety and the health of its citizens and its residents. And the US government under Trump has failed to do that. So it needs to from that perspective, but it also needs to in terms of global leadership. Sort of the defining characteristic of the post-war years down to the present has been America's global leadership. And the coronavirus pandemic response, this is an extraordinary opportunity for the US government under Biden to show that America can deal with this, because China is on its own way vying and competing to outperform America with the coronavirus response. This is really this is a lightning rod, a sort of litmus test for the challenge of this century, which is between the US and China and global affairs, and the two superpowers trying to show who can get the coronavirus under power quickly and efficiently. And so far, the US is losing that battle. So I think that it has to happen on so many different levels, geopolitically and domestically, for public health.
Is the US ready to step up to the plate? Because here in Denmark and across Europe, we want to hear about what Biden's response to NATO is going to be. Are we going to have a reset in US strategy and in US relations? What's Biden's point of view on Greenland? Does the US still want to buy it? Are they going to try and swap it for Puerto Rico, which I think was the latest things that I heard? And broadly, what's going to be the American position against Russia? Again, something which is incredibly pertinent here in Europe. And like you say, China as well. But to do those things, you need to be a strong nation. The US is currently incredibly divided. Is it not going to be internal politics that's just going to hamper the first term, and probably the only term, of the Biden administration?
Well, I think, James, you sort of stolen the words out of my mouth. I think that's absolutely right. That what President-elect Biden has already announced he's going to do is, through a series of presidential executive orders, to bring the US back into the Paris climate agreement, that he's going to systematically undo a lot of Trump's executive orders over the past 4 years, bring the US back into the World Health Organization. So he's already issued that's what he will do on day one. And that's good news internationally. However, you're quite right. Underlying all of this is the very uncomfortable fact that 68 million people voted for Trump. There's a lot of people in the United States that think that they wanted 4 more years of exactly what we've seen. And if the Biden administration doesn't work to try to integrate them into the conversation and to actually recognize that the grievances they had are real and that they're not going to go away, and in fact 4 years of Biden they might actually even amplify, then that's going to be a problem. So you're quite right. Internationally, you're pushing it seems that Biden's pushing it an open door with leaders in Europe. But there is this absolutely systemic underlying problem within the US about how polarized and how divided its society is. I've been thinking overnight as the thinking about this election, and I just keep coming back to the idea that really what the US needs is some sort of truth and reconciliation commission. And I say that not kind of like rhetoric, glibly, but it really does feel, you read history accounts of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Yesterday felt a lot like that. There were street parties in New York. There were street parties here in Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, cities throughout the US. It felt like the end of a authoritarian regime. The underlying issues that resulted in that regime are still here today, the day after. In fact, they're probably amplified. And so I think the US could really do with understanding how regimes that have had, whether it's systemic racism, apartheid South Africa, or Eastern Bloc regimes, how they've come to terms with it. I think the Germans, as always, have a wonderful word for it. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. And the US has never actually had that Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Your listeners are probably going to correct my horrible German, but that's my the best I can do. Never had that with racism in the US. And it rears its ugly head periodically. And we have seen that over the past 4 years. It's not going to go away. And so some sort of, as I said, Truth and Reconciliation Commission to expose what happened, to have a conversation, and to integrate polarized parts of the US society that are just simply not talking to each other at the moment, seems to me the only viable way forward. Because it's you can't have US superpower, global power on the international stage if you can't first, as the other question suggested, actually have some sort of unity at home.
So President Biden and Vice President Harris have got a lot of work to do over the next,
to say the least.
To say the least. And I think that it's safe to say that 2021 is probably going to be as eventful as 2020, if that is possible. But thank you so much, Calder, for coming on and giving us just a little bit of insight into what is a really complex and turbulent period.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.